Welcome to the fourth talk in our autumn-winter programme. I'm here in our weaving workshop, surrounded by some of the museum's handlooms, where our weavers produce damask every day for visitors. And I'm getting ready to talk to tonight's speaker, Dr. Cormac Moore. Given current government restrictions, it's not possible to live stream from the museum, so our talk is pre-recorded. However, a number of you have forwarded me questions, and I'll try and pose them during the Q&A. Cormac is historian in residence with Dublin City Council and author of a number of books, including The Irish Soccer Split and 2019's The Birth of the Border. In his talk tonight, Cormac will explore the impact of partition from law to sport, agriculture to civic life.
Good evening. This evening, I will look at the impact of partition in and around the time of the birth of the Irish border, not just from political and security perspectives, which have dominated studies on partition previously, but also from economic, social, and cultural perspectives. Specifically, I will cover the areas of politics, security, law, business and trade, religion, education, labour, infrastructure and services, and finally sport. The 22nd of June 1921 was a day of pomp and ceremony, ushering in a new era in Ireland's history. Despite dire warnings, King George V and Queen Mary came to Belfast to officially open the new Parliament of the new entity, Northern Ireland. Belfast was draped with flags and bunting. Pavements and lampposts were painted red, white, and blue. And here are some images from the day. Despite the pageantry of the day, there was enormous security, with armed policemen placed in commandeered houses along the route. The opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament was boycotted by almost the entire Catholic community, with the Catholic Primate of Ireland, Cardinal Michael Logue, turning down an invitation to the opening ceremony due to a prior engagement, he said. To mark the occasion, the IRA attacked a troop train returning from the official opening of the Belfast Parliament, derailing it at Atavoyle on the Louth Armagh border. 4 men and 80 horses were killed. Northern Ireland faced significant political challenges from its birth. In the eyes of many on the island, including 1/3 of the population within its territory, it lacked legitimacy. Although by signing the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921, Sinn Féin had formally accepted partition. The inclusion of Article 12 with its Boundary Commission gave hope to nationalists of the transfer of much of Northern territory to the Free State, leaving the remainder as an unviable rump. One of the objectives of the treaty, at least on the British side, was to normalise relations between both Irish jurisdictions. In many ways, the treaty led to the opposite. The Boundary Commission hung over Northern Ireland. Nationalists felt they could continue to ignore and obstruct the northern state, particularly in areas of nationalist majorities. It just added to the vulnerability and paranoia of Unionists. The Northern Ireland Prime Minister, James Craig, stated as much to Winston Churchill in May 1922, claiming the Boundary Commission has been at the root of all evil. The prospect of some levels of cooperation evaporated, replaced by a siege mentality to protect the North's interests from the South and from those disloyal elements within its territory. The Northern government was allowed to take whatever measures it saw fit. In the Northern House of Commons, there was no opposition, with the Sinn Féin and Nationalist MPs abstaining from the Parliament. As the House of Commons elected the members of the Senate, there were only Unionist senators too. Other than providing financial support, the British government mainly adopted a laissez-faire approach, allowing the devolved Northern government to manage its own affairs unimpeded. The makeup of the cabinet of the first Northern government was also a significant factor in determining how the South and internal opposition was dealt with. All cabinet members were drawn from the upper layers of Protestant Ulster society, and all had close links with the Orange Order. The local elections of 1920 had been deeply embarrassing for the Unionists, losing many local authorities and seats to nationalists and the Labour movement. Most nationalist-controlled local authorities within Northern Ireland chose a policy of non-recognition of the new jurisdiction. Both Fermanagh and Tyrone County Councils declared allegiance to Dáil Éireann on 28 of November 1921. The Northern Government suspended both councils, with the police taking over the headquarters in Omagh and Enniskillen and impounding their records. In total, 21 nationalist-controlled authorities, including those of Newry, Armagh, Strabane, Cookstown, Downpatrick, Magherafelt and Keady, were suspended by April 1922. Unionists west of the Bann River demanded further punishment. It led to some of the most significant decisions the government made that had long-lasting repercussions. On top of suspending councils, it looked to take back control of them. It did this by abolishing proportional representation, PR, compelling councillors to pledge an oath of allegiance to the Crown, and gerrymandering regions to reduce radically the number of local councils held by nationalists. Here is a satirical cartoon of Craig explaining to a child, "Proportional representation, laddie, means confusion in Ulster." The abolition of PR for parliamentary elections impacted most negatively on the Labour movement, with elections largely becoming sectarian headcounts on the legitimacy of Northern Ireland and the border. The removal of PR was followed by the rearrangement of local government boundaries. Unionist control of local and national government was consolidated by direct and indirect economic discrimination in employment, both in the public and private sectors, and in the distribution of public consumption benefits, especially public housing. The provisional government, the transitional government for the 26 counties until the Irish Free State officially came into being on 6th of December 1922, led by Michael Collins, had the difficult task of trying to prevent a civil war within its own jurisdiction and react to conflict in the northern jurisdiction almost from the very moment of its inception. Collins, almost alone among the leadership of Sinn Féin, had come to accept the reality of partition and strove to do something to undermine it. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, complained to Churchill, "We could get Mr. Collins to talk about nothing else." Collins pursued a dangerous path of pursuing peace through pacts with James Craig in January and March of 1922, on the one hand, and sanctioning a policy of military activity along and across the border on the other. The pacts with Craig were in many ways a public front for Collins, who by his other actions sought to destabilise the northern jurisdiction. On top of arming the IRA for engagements in the north, Collins led a policy of non-recognition of the 6 counties, which caused deep frustration for the British and Northern Irish governments. One of the primary policies of non-recognition involved the payment of salaries of teachers based in Northern Ireland who refused to recognise the 6 counties' Ministry of Education. The provisional government was also extremely tardy in transferring civil service personnel and files to Belfast. Collins met with opposition from within the provisional government for his policy on the north, and once he was killed in August 1922, a new policy prevailed to recognise the northern government and to discontinue the obstructionist policies. Leading the new initiative was Ernest Blythe, Minister for Local Government and an Ulster-born Protestant. The civil war in the south was a contributing factor in the delay of the convening of the Boundary Commission, as were the non-cooperation of the Northern Government and several changes of government in Britain. The Free State Government was the first to appoint its Commissioner to the Boundary Commission, Owen McNeill, the Minister for Education, in July 1923. Almost a year later, in June 1924, the British government appointed the chairperson, Richard Feetham, a judge based in South Africa. With the Northern government refusing to appoint its commissioner, the British intervened by selecting Joseph R. Fisher. The commission met for the first time in November 1924. The work completed by the commission would not be revealed for decades due to a leaking of the recommendations by the pro-unionist newspaper, The Morning Post, in November 1925. Much to the surprise of many nationalists, no large-scale transfers were on offer. In fact, a rich portion of East Donegal was to be transferred to the north. The leaked report recommended the shortening of the border by 50 miles, transferring 286 square miles to the south and 77 square miles to the north. The leak caused outrage in Dublin, leading to MacNeill resigning from the Commission, the Free State government, and even the Dáil, claiming as he departed that he wasn't the most suitable person to be a commissioner. Pleading ignorance of the Commission's findings, the President of the Free State Executive Council, W.T. Cosgrave, claimed it would be a farce and a travesty if the forecasts which had been published were correct. Realising the danger the crisis posed to the government, he dashed over to London to have the report shelved. James Craig suggested for the Free State to be relieved of part of the British national debt. The Free State government accepted Craig's suggestion, showing the extent to which the Free State government was prepared to purchase its own independence at the expense of Irish unity. The border remained as it is to the present day. Cosgrave was fooling a few people by calling the agreement a damn good bargain. The Free State government and its Sinn Féin predecessor had failed politically just as it had militarily in preventing partition and unifying the island. Northern Ireland experienced very violent beginnings. Between 1920 and 1922, waves of violence encompassing many sectarian deaths engulfed the 6 counties. It is estimated that over 550 people were killed violently in the 6 counties in this period. Approximately 300 of the dead were Catholics, over 170 were Protestants, and over 80 were members of the security forces. Belfast accounted for the vast bulk of the deaths, with just under 460. Catholics, with 1/4 of the population of Belfast, suffered over 70% of the deaths in the city. Catholic relief organisations estimated that 23,000 Catholics had been forced out of their homes and that about 500 Catholic-owned businesses had been destroyed. Relief funds were also set up for Unionists affected by the violence during this era. And here is an artist's impression of relief being offered to loyalists in Belfast. As the Government of Ireland Bill was making its way through Parliament for much of 1920, tensions in Ulster started to boil over. Violence that started in Derry City soon moved further east. Here's some images of the violence in Derry. Returning from the 12th of the July holiday, on 21st of July in Belfast, calls were made for the expulsion of all non-loyal workers from the shipyards. Straight afterwards, a mob went on a rampage looking for potential victims. Some were stripped of their undergarments in a search for Catholic emblems such as rosary beads. Many were severely beaten. Catholics were soon expelled from many other companies in Belfast. It is estimated that a total of 10,000 men and 1,000 women workers were expelled, about 10% of the national population of Belfast. Protestant socialists, known as rotten prods, were also expelled from their jobs. The unrest travelled from the workplace to the streets of Belfast, resulting in 19 dead and many more wounded or homeless within 5 days. Here are some images from the violence in Belfast. Even though most of the violence was perpetrated against Catholics, Craig demanded that an Ulster Special Constabulary be established to just serve for the area that would become Northern Ireland. And even though the British government recognised that they could be accused of taking sides and ceasing to govern impartially, they granted Craig his Special Constabulary. The Ulster Special Constabulary came into existence on 1st November 1920 with an initial strength of 3,000 planned. Whilst hostilities ceased in the south after the truce on the 11th of July 1921, the birth of Northern Ireland in the summer of 1921 witnessed another wave of intense sectarian violence engulfing Belfast, resulting in the highest number of casualties since the shipyard expulsions of the previous summer. Enlarged IRA and Loyalist forces led to a renewed confrontation in late November. Bombs were thrown into trams, carrying shipyard workers home, killing 8 and wounding 9 others. Here is an artist's impression of a tram in Belfast, with passengers crouching, lights out, and windows wired against bombs. On the 14th of January 1922, Dan Hogan was one of several Gaelic footballers from Monaghan arrested by the specials in Dromore in County Tyrone. Hogan's brother Michael was killed in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday. They were on their way to the GAA's Ulster Senior Football Final in Derry City, where they intended to rescue 3 men on their death sentence in Derry jail. The arrest prompted Collins to order a major IRA incursion across the border into the counties of Tyrone and Fermanagh on the night of 7th and 8th of February. Some 40 prominent loyalists were seized and taken south. The kidnapped loyalists were held as hostages until the Derry jail and football prisoners were released. The kidnappings caused uproar in the Unionist community. The Northern government subsequently bolstered the border areas with many more specials. The roads crossing into the Free State were then made impassable by blowing up bridges or digging trenches, and were covered by constabulary posts. Only the main roads were left open, and on these there were permanent roadblocks. After a skirmish at Clones railway station in County Monaghan, which led to the deaths of 4 specials and many more wounded and captured, violence erupted in Belfast, resulting in 34 people being killed in 13th and 15th of February. One of the incidents that occurred then was one of the most horrific of all that occurred during those 2 years of violence in Belfast. When in Weaver Street off York Road in North Belfast, a grenade was thrown at a group of Catholic children playing. 2 died instantly and 4 more subsequently died from their wounds. Between February 11 and the end of March, 51 Catholics were killed, with 115 wounded, and 32 Protestants were killed, with 86 wounded. The most notorious incident in March was the McMahon murders of 24th of March. After the IRA killed 2 specials on the 23rd of March, the home of Owen McMahon, a Catholic publican, was attacked early the next morning, where all the male members in the house were shot, resulting in 6 deaths. Here are some images from that incident. The IRA sought revenge. On 31st of March, a bomb was thrown into the home of Francis Donnelly, a Protestant on Brown Street, severely wounding him and his 2 daughters. His 2 boys, aged 12 and 2, died from their injuries. One of the most identifiable consequences of partition was the forced displacement of people, those on the wrong side of the border. Many moved to Scotland and England. Others relocated to towns along the border, such as Dundalk. Dublin saw large numbers of refugees arriving throughout the first half of 1922. Pictured is a young Belfast refugee outside Marlborough Hall in Glasnevin in Dublin. It would be an exaggeration to suggest that Northern Ireland was in peril of going out of existence during the height of the IRA attacks on its territory. It was beleaguered though, and the British government was tired of the crippling costs of maintaining such a large and one-sided security apparatus. Even though the Northern government controlled the Special Constabulary, the British government financed it with vast sums of money. The Royal Irish Constabulary was formally disbanded in May 1922 and replaced by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC. In the beginning of June, as the North's new regular police force. Whilst the specials remained exclusively Protestant in composition, in the end, Catholics comprised 1/6 of the numbers of the RUC, not 1/3 as allocated. No attempt was made to increase this proportion, and by the late 1960s, Catholics only made up 10% of the RUC. The Northern Offensive of May 1922 transpired to the last military attempt by the Free State to destabilise the North. It involved pro- and anti-treaty troops from all over Ireland. Belfast was engulfed in dozens of serious fires. Railway stations and mills were destroyed. By the end of June, support from the south had ceased, though, and the supply of men and arms had dried up. The civil war there had begun. The northern divisions of the IRA were disbanded, many moving south to join the Free State Army. One of the primary reasons for the move south was the large-scale enforcement of the Special Powers Act after the assassination of an MP, W.J. Twadwell, on 22nd of May. Twadwell was shot dead on the way to his outfitter's shop. The Northern government then ordered the roundup of some 500 Sinn Féin sympathisers. 300 of them were interned on board the Argenta, a converted cargo vessel transformed to a prison ship. The response from the authorities was ferocious. Leading IRA member in Belfast, Seamus Woods, reported, "The enemy are continually raiding and arresting. The heavy sentences, and particularly the flogging, making the civilians very loath to keep wanted men or arms. The IRA in the north retreated. Nothing demonstrated the complexity of creating a jurisdiction from scratch, arguably more so than the law. Under the Government of Ireland Act 1920, the judiciary of Ireland was divided into two judiciaries, North and South. There was also a counter system of justice in place, the Republican or Dáil courts, when Ireland was partitioned. Whilst the Free State was presented with most aspects of a functioning legal system, Northern Ireland was faced with the gargantuan task of creating a whole new justice system for a new entity. The person chosen to be the first Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland was a Catholic, Sir Denis Henry. Whilst Henry was a Catholic, he was not a nationalist, holding a truly unique position by being a Catholic Ulster Unionist MP before he was appointed as Lord Chief Justice. He was faced with the unenviable task of ensuring the judiciary and official appointments, as well as a functioning justice system, were in place. He also had to secure a building as a courthouse. The government purchased the site of the old potato market and was here that the new law courts opened in 1933. For the 12 years before the permanent courthouse was built, it was necessary to use temporary accommodation. The Antrim County Courthouse on the Crumlin Road in Belfast was chosen as the best option available at the time. The Government of Ireland Act had practically severed the Bar of Ireland into two bodies, but all the then existing members of the Bar had the right of audience in both areas of Ireland reserved to them. One of those was Frances Kyle, the first woman to be called to the Irish Bar in November 1921. Kyle was immediately followed by Avril Deverell on the same day. Both women made headlines around the world for being the first women to be called to the bar in Britain or Ireland. That day was also the first call of a divided Irish bar. Kyle, originally from Belfast, pursued her professional career in Northern Ireland, whilst Deverell, from Greystones in County Wicklow, pursued her career in the south. Kyle, like all other students from Northern Ireland at the time, still had to study at King's Inns in Dublin to qualify as a barrister. This arrangement continued until 1925. Reconciling two distinct political and judicial entities under the King's Inns umbrella proved difficult, and strain started to show. The Northern Committee of King's Inns was irked that some in the South were exempt from taking examinations for war service, as the war service in question was in some cases in the forces opposed to the Crown. Those exempted included Kevin O'Higgins, Minister for Justice in the Free State. King's Inns ignored the Northern Committee's threats to leave and even inflamed the situation by proposing that Irish should be a compulsory language for a call to the Irish Bar. The Northern Bar decided to sever connections and subsequently established an Inns of Court of Northern Ireland, which was inaugurated at the Belfast Law Courts on the 11th of January 1926. The main common link between both Irish justice systems was now broken. The partition of Ireland coincided with prolonged periods of economic stagnation and decline for both Irish jurisdictions. During the interwar period, economic depression prevailed, forcing thousands into unemployment and emigration. Northern Ireland was hard hit by recessions in its traditional industries, shipbuilding, linen, and agriculture. For the linen industry, this decline was permanent. There was little effort to cooperate economically with each other during this period. Iterations of Sinn Féin introduced measures that guaranteed a divergence in both jurisdictions on trade, with its Belfast boycott campaign in 1920 and the Irish Free State's introduction of customs barriers in 1923. The expulsions of Catholic workers and the sectarian violence in the north saw Sinn Féin make one of its first decisions directly relating to the north. It started a boycott. Dáil Éireann imposed a boycott of goods from Belfast and a withdrawal of funds from Belfast-based banks. In reality, the boycott soon extended to other businesses and farming, and beyond Belfast too. Many saw it as an anti-partitionist move, a way to show that Northern Ireland could not survive without the rest of Ireland. The boycott involved members of the IRA intercepting and destroying products that originated in the northeast, and southern traders were banned from doing business with their northern counterparts. To prevent goods from entering regions, trains were raided by the IRA. Sinn Féin claimed the boycott was achieving results. Many wholesale firms declared they were badly hit, losing 75% of their trade outside of Ulster. Northern salespeople on the road frequently returned with no orders. Joseph McDonough, the boycott director, boasted that except in Antrim and Down, it was impossible for a Belfast merchant to sell as much as a bootlace in any other part of Ireland. Ulster traders responded by forming a group, the Ulster Traders Defence Association, to impose a counter-boycott, claiming the boycott is at present being carried on more bitterly than ever. Ulster people were urged not to buy any southern goods, clothing, meat, butter, biscuits, furniture, stout and whisky. With the start of the Civil War in the South, the enforcement of the boycott became even more uneven and sporadic, eventually petering out. Its legacy of driving a psychological wedge between North and South continued far longer though. Economically, the boycott had a negative impact on trade in Belfast and other areas in the north of Ireland. In all probability, Belfast trade with the South never recovered to its pre-boycott level, halved by 1924. The boycott also had a negative economic effect on those imposing it, resulting in goods costing more to the consumer and diminished profits for traders. Northern-based banks such as Ulster Bank, Northern Bank and the Belfast Bank saw business reduce, deposits down and some sub-branches having to close in the south. Here's an Ulster Bank building in Waterford. The Belfast Bank lost 1/5 of its deposits outside of Northern Ireland and decided to close all of its southern branches in 1923. The boycott had minimal impact on its three main industries though: agriculture, shipbuilding and linen, as they mainly supplied to international markets. Ernest Blythe claimed the boycott would threaten the northern shipbuilding industry no more than a summer shower would threaten Cave Hill. Whilst its economic effects to hamper trade in Belfast met with mixed results, the boycott's aim to unify Ireland was an unmitigated disaster. It resulted in further psychological and physical divisions between North and South, some that had never existed before. Another step by the Free State government in March 1923 had arguably the biggest impact in cementing partition: the imposition of customs duties on import goods. The creation of a customs barrier was key in translating partition into reality. It did so in a bid to achieve fiscal independence from Britain and to generate revenue for the Exchequer. It was also an attempt to apply economic pressure on the nascent Northern Ireland jurisdiction. In announcing the imposition, the government stated that pending a decision as to the future boundary line, a temporary frontier would be placed along the boundary line between the 6 northern and 26 southern counties. This temporary frontier on imported goods lasted for over 70 years, only rescinded due to the introduction of the single market throughout the European Union in 1993. Businesses, trade associations and charities were all impacted by the partition of Ireland. The partitioning of health insurance involved three parties: the insurance commissioners, the approved insurance societies or companies, and the insured people themselves. The approved insurance societies protested strongly against their partition, claiming that dividing the work of the societies would dislocate the whole machinery of national health insurance. The largest industry in Ireland, agriculture, had worked effectively under an All-Ireland Agricultural Department before partition. Even though the department was divided, responsibility for fisheries and the administration of the Diseases of Animals Act were reserved for the Council of Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act. The department was a particularly complex one, making it extremely difficult to divide. Before partition, the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction branches included agricultural, technical instruction, statistics and intelligence, accounts, transit and markets, veterinary, fisheries, and agricultural wages board. According to the department, there were examples where the staffs are not interchangeable, in some instances consisting of one specialist only. By and large, problems were overcome, and both departments, North and South, did learn to cooperate with each other in areas of common interest, such as disease control. In a rare occurrence, both agricultural ministers met in 1926 to to discuss areas of common concern. A peculiar aspect of partition in Ireland, compared to other divided jurisdictions, is the number of organisations who have chosen to ignore it. Many business, trade and charity groups formed before 1921 remained all-Ireland bodies, including Unionist-leaning ones. There was no compunction or obligation for most organisations to follow suit once the new international frontier was created with the partition of Ireland. With the confusing nature of partition, the uncertainty surrounding its viability, it is little wonder that most bodies remained all-Ireland entities. Retaining all-Ireland structures was also a feature within many sporting bodies, trade unions and religious organisations. The spectre of partition posed vast problems and some opportunities for the Catholic Church and the main Protestant churches. With the partition of Ireland, the Catholic Church saw itself receiving the best and worst of outcomes with the creation of both jurisdictions. It went on to exert huge control over the Irish Free State on the one hand, and became the main voice for the significant but powerless minority in Northern Ireland on the other. There was never a question of the Catholic Church dividing itself along partitionist lines. It remained an all-Ireland body. The primate of all Ireland was the Archbishop of Armagh, and as a body, the whole hierarchy in Ireland met regularly. In fact, of all organisations that were all-Ireland bodies before partition, religious ones had the highest number that remained so after partition. With the partitioning of Ireland, the three main Protestant churches retained their all-Ireland structures. In 1920, the primate of the Church of Ireland, Charles Frederick Darcy, emphatically declared that he did not believe that the creation of an administrative boundary would lead to a corresponding division in the Church. If it did, it would be proof of a very feeble flickering life in the Church, he said. Even though the majority of Church of Ireland members resided in Northern Ireland, the machinery of the Church remained largely based in the South. Due to the major constitutional changes that affected the island of Ireland in the early 1920s, a new legal foundation needed to be created for the Irish Methodist Church to be able to continue as an all-Ireland body. Bills were passed in the Irish Free State and in Northern Ireland in 1928. This Methodist Church Act of 1928 was the first instance in which the two parliaments acted identically and simultaneously, allowing the Methodist Church to continue its work throughout the whole island. The one religion in Ireland that saw the greatest institutional changes due to partition was Judaism. It was no longer organised on an all-Ireland basis. Both Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State were able to show greater scope for separate expressions of how education was to be run in a divided rather than a united country. Such separate expressions were clearly demonstrated in the very different approaches taken on education within both jurisdictions. Whereas Northern Ireland, with Lord Londonderry as Minister of Education, introduced wide-ranging changes that essentially sought to democratise education, the South imposed minimal structural reforms but fundamentally changed the education system in its attempt to Gaelicise Ireland. The divergence in paths was also clearly illustrated by the obstructionist tactics of the South, who refused to recognise the Northern jurisdiction, and the failure of both entities to cooperate on areas of common interest, such as teacher training and examinations. The labour movement was also faced with many challenges when the country was partitioned. The movement included a divergent group of people who had to operate under enormous sectarian and political pressures. Belfast Labour candidates who ran as independents in the 1921 election to the Northern Ireland Parliament folded their campaign once loyalists prevented them from holding an election rally in the Ulster Hall. The Irish Labour movement was not a homogeneous group, with many Protestants and Catholics, Unionists and Nationalists, as well as Socialist Internationalists. A delicate juggling act was required within the political party and the trade unions after the onset of partition. The labour movement in the north sought to avoid contention and remain united by focusing on labour and trade union issues, on wages and conditions for workers. With a mainly Protestant anti-unionist leadership and a mainly Protestant unionist membership, mutually dependent for their bread and butter, but otherwise at odds, they found themselves walking a tight line between their organisational interests and the politics of their members. Some involved in the Belfast Labour Party, like William McMullen, sought to move further away from the British Labour Party, whilst others such as Sam Kyle, Hugh Gemmell and Harry Midgley concentrated on supplying a non-sectarian opposition to the governing Unionists with British Labour as their model and ideological base. The issues of social reform kept them united. With such divergent views on partition, the topic was avoided as often as possible. The Irish Trades Union Congress, ITUC, remained an all-Ireland body, primarily because there was no feasible alternative in the north and there was little interest in forming an Ulster Trades Union Congress. William O'Brien, General Secretary of the Irish Transport and General Workers' Union, emphasised in 1925 the fact that the working class in Ireland recognises no political or geographical border. Partition prevails almost exclusively in the political sphere. Recognising that as trade unions and members based in Northern Ireland needed to be treated differently, a Northern Ireland Committee of the ITUC was established to speak for all trade unions in the North and all trade unionists. The labour movement achieved partial union, particularly within trade unionism, by clinging to core interests within the movement and by offering a large degree of autonomy to Northern labour activists. The complexity of the railway infrastructure and ownership within Ireland was compounded dramatically by the creation of a border. 5 railway companies were directly affected by the new border by serving both sides of it. This was further exacerbated by the Free State's decision to impose a customs barrier in 1923. Both Irish governments agreed the Free State would legislate for railway companies based solely in the Free State territory, and the Northern government would not look to amalgamate railway companies in Northern Ireland with British ones. Cross-border cooperation was harder won on the issue of fishing rights on Lough and River Foyle. Disputes over fishing on the Foyle spanned for 3 decades after partition. The disputes showed the haphazard way in which the border was drawn up. No boundary was delimited at any point for either Lough Foyle or Lough Carlingford. Nobody knew where the borderline was on various waterways straddling the border as a result. The postal services were, like the railways, a reserved service under the Government of Ireland Act. With the Anglo-Irish Treaty overriding the Government of Ireland Act for the 26 counties, the Irish Free State took control of its postal services, whilst the Imperial Parliament in Westminster retained control of the postal services for Northern Ireland. The Northern government found it very hard to assert its independence from the rest of Ireland on the issue of postal services. Its dependence on cooperating with a Free State included residents in border areas in the north being reliant on Free State post offices to deliver their mail, sensitive mail for security forces being routed through Free State post offices, and mail from Britain being delivered via the Holyhead-Dunleary route to different locales in Northern Ireland. The political partition of the island of Ireland posed problems for all sporting bodies in Ireland. The border forced all sports to look at their internal governance structures. Unlike in soccer and athletics and cycling, most Irish governing bodies managed to maintain unity by considerable compromise, as issues of political symbolism were tailored to accommodate diverse political and cultural interests. There was a readiness from many sporting bodies to incorporate inoffensive and neutral flags, such as the Four Provinces flag, and anthems and emblems to maintain unity. Great efforts were also made to democratise the internal governance structures of those sports. Most sports that remained united also did not have the identity issues faced by sports like soccer. Sports such as rugby, hockey, cricket, tennis and bowls were primarily the preserve of Protestants from the upper classes of society. The GAA, as a pan-nationalist association dominated by Catholics, did little to encourage Protestant and Unionist membership. Soccer, like athletics and cycling, had to cater for different religions and classes. This talk has shown how matters of state policy impacted on people and the organisations they were involved in. It is clear that there was a lot more complexity, ambiguity, and flexibility during this period than simplistic narratives of the past recall. By moving beyond looking at history from a rear-view mirror and instead focusing on the lived experience of people and organisations at the time, we can see that the political and legal partition of Ireland was not followed by a social and cultural partition. Given the piecemeal and haphazard implementation of partition, it was only natural that there would be a myriad of reactions, counter-reactions, and interactions from people and organisations. Generally, the Northern government gave no clear political direction on what path organisations themselves should take once Ireland was partitioned. Although the Northern government sought as little cooperation with the Irish Free State as possible, for pragmatic reasons, Unionist politicians agreed to maintain all Ireland functions for areas such as postal services. In fact, an anomalous position existed whereby Unionist politicians such as Thomas Moles and John Andrews sought as much divergence politically between the North and the South on the one hand, and actively sought unity in sport on the other. Overall, organisations in Ireland were not subsumed by the Ireland grip of the nation state and generally chose to pursue their own paths in the interests of their members, in pursuit of their own local interests. And if you want to find out more, you can check out my book, Birth of the Border, which goes into detail on all of the topics we've discussed today. Thank you for your time.
So thanks very much for your talk there, Cormac. Really enjoyable, really interesting. I have some questions that people have sent in for me to pose to you. A few other things. So you finished on your book there, and I read your book over the Christmas break and really enjoyed it. And this is more a comment than anything. So Ernest Clark, he plays like a sort of pivotal role. You bring that out in the book in up the Northern Ireland government, and I think you mentioned maybe 20 or so people.
Yeah.
And I was sort of struck that it was a fairly remarkable thing to do, like what they achieved, setting aside like rights and wrongs, but like on a purely administrative basis, it was quite an impressive feat.
Absolutely, yeah. I find Clark a fascinating character, and it's surprising that he's so little known, considering what he did in such a short period of time. And I think we have to go back and remember, like even though Ireland wasn't united when it was under the Act of Union, it was treated very separately to the rest of the United Kingdom. In that everything was it was administered as an all Ireland entity. So the British government set up the machinery of an all Ireland approach in terms of you have your Lord Lieutenant, you have your Chief Secretary, you have all of the civil service in Dublin Castle, and then you have a lot of other bodies, government and non-government bodies that are all headquartered in Dublin. And this whole structure of government for a kind of a devolved country in many respects, based in Dublin. And all of a sudden, you create this new jurisdiction. You basically pull the 6 counties out of that, and you actually create a new jurisdiction from scratch. That was an absolutely gargantuan task, particularly when there was no appetite to have this jurisdiction. Nobody asked for a new government in Belfast, particularly for 6 counties. Who even came up with the word Northern Ireland? That name would have been foreign to people at the time. So for Ernest Clark, his job was essentially make this come into being. As you said, he was only about 20 people in the staff. He himself said, "I was armed only with a table, a chair, and an Act of Parliament." And he was working like 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, right up until May 1921, to make sure there were 7 government departments. They had buildings, that they were staffed. The staff had actually accommodation. Huge job, and it was a pretty incredible feat actually by him.
Yeah, and he had some trouble getting people from the south to come up and help, isn't that right?
Even before the Free State was formed, even before the Provisional Government was formed, a lot of people in the civil service in Dublin would have been against partition and were actively opposed in, first of all, going up to the north, and secondly, transferring files. That continued up until 1923, 1924, of particularly when it comes to transferring files and information, but also with people, trying to get people was really difficult. But it also has to be said that the Northern Ireland's approach to hiring Catholics was against the Government of Ireland Act, and that Catholics were discriminated against when it came to getting jobs in the civil service. There was a very senior civil servant, H.P. Boland, was recommended by the British government, but the Northern government said, "We can't accept him. You know the reason why. It was because he was Catholic." There was even a telephonist in Richard Dawson Bates' Home Affairs Department And once Richard Austin Bates found out there was someone on the telephone who was a Catholic, he actually refused to answer his own phone because he thought this person would be a secessionist and disloyal, and that person had to be removed before he would answer the phone again. So even though there was reluctance on people from Dublin Castle going to the north, there also were limits in what Catholics could do in joining the Northern Ireland Civil Service.
So a little earlier than the establishment of Northern Ireland, in your book you mentioned it's a Church of Ireland report from 1917 from the convention, and quite an interesting phrase. They noted that coercion of Ulster was unthinkable, while partitioning of Ireland was disastrous.
Yeah.
Do you, in your work on this, have you any sense of what might have worked? It's a big question.
It's a big question, yeah. What if for you, really? It was obviously a very difficult conundrum. It still is. It's obviously has still not been solved. It still is hugely contested entity. It's still a deeply divided society in Northern Ireland. I personally, I'm not sure what would have worked. I think we have to remember the Unionists had a lot of support from the British government at the time, and that allowed them to be, to be very hardline in their approach and not to compromise or not to negotiate. But I think if we look back then again, if we move away from kind of the rear view mirror kind of approach and what was happening on the ground, this notion that unions wouldn't compromise, it's probably not fair either. And this idea of Sinn Féin and Ulster Unionists were totally opposed to each other, that's gone too far as well, because Craig met with De Valera in May 1921 before the truce happened. Craig and Collins had pacts in January and March 1922, even though the North said the North was nothing to do with the South. But there was this capacity if those avenues had been explored to compromise. Personally, I think what could have happened and would have been accepted by Sinn Féin would have been, and the Ulster Unionists couldn't have much complaint if it did happen, was if Tyrone and Fermanagh went to the south, because of the Catholic majorities within those regions. I think that's where you could have had some kind of reasoning. But what happened was certainly seen as unfair, and rightly so too. There was no plebiscite, and it was very unusual that there was no plebiscite at the time, because there was a lot of other partitions happening. Most of them had plebiscites, and this wasn't offered to two people from Ulster. And I think if there was a plebiscite offered, you probably would have had Tyrone and Fermanagh going to the south, and then you could have had a four-county, Northern Ireland. But who knows? Who knows? It's guesswork, obviously.
But if the First World War hadn't broken out and home rule for Ireland in the British Empire, would that have worked? Maybe. Who knows?
Well, we obviously know what Herbert Asquith said, that the start of the First World War prevented a civil war in Ireland. It was a case of cutting off one's head to get rid of a headache. Like the Civil War was a genuine problem, or there was a genuine possibility. There was very little signs of compromise. This is before the rise of Sinn Féin as well. You have to remember. So for all of the compromising that John Redmond did, he didn't get any further in changing Ulster Unionist approach or ability to compromise with nationalists.
So the treaty debates. So the Catholic hierarchy complained that the Dáil was more upset by the oath of allegiance and issues of sovereignty than actually partition in the north. So what I'm asking, was there a mismatch between southern aspirations and the northern reality, what was happening on the ground in the north?
Yeah, I think so. I think Sinn Féin was particularly weak when it came to the north. It didn't have any clear policy on how to deal with Ulster Unionists. Right from the time it started to gain a lot of popularity with the by-election success in 1917, and particularly once it became the de facto voice of nationalism after the 1918 general election. It had no coherent policy. It was very contradictory messages as well. Sometimes there were very bellicose, belligerent language used against the Ulster Unionists. And then there was talks of, once Britain leaves, the Ulster Unionists will happily come into United Ireland. It was really naive belief. And it was born on the fact that most of the leaders of Sinn Féin weren't from the north, really. So, and even the people from the north, people like Owen McNeill, Ernest Blythe and Sean McEntee, they were more accustomed to southern politics than they were to northern politics. So yeah, there was this disconnect between what was happening on the north and on the ground. And if we look at the amount of time and energy spent on sovereignty, and most nationalists, whether it was pro or anti-treaty nationalists, they accepted the Boundary Commission, even though it was a terrible a piece of part of the act because it's so ambiguous, and they didn't scrutinise it. There was no scrutiny in the Dáil debates. Just 9 of the 300 plus pages of debates were devoted to partition. Most of it was on sovereignty. And if people had really looked at the fine details of that Article 12 on the Boundary Commission, they would have realised that this was not going to lead to the huge transfer of land back to the Ireland as they envisaged. So perhaps it was because they just weren't really as interested in the North as they were in other areas.
So in terms of northern policy, you mentioned in your talk Ernest Blythe.
Yeah.
We were not too far away from where we are today. It was in and out of Lisburn all the time. And he had sort of perhaps a greater appreciation of the North and what would work and what wouldn't than perhaps others in the Dáil, particularly because he had that Northern Protestant background. I don't know, are you able to speak any more about his role in shaping the policy to the North or anything about his reputation in the South?
But he obviously became Minister of Finance. He had to make very severe cuts and developed a very bad reputation from the severity of the cuts. And his later life, certainly did not cover himself in glory. Being involved in various kind of very right wing groups politically. But at the time, he got some things right. I think he was right about the boycott. He and people like Countess Markievicz were opposed to the boycott. They said it actually would lead to increased partition. It would actually lead to a further psychological partition. But I think when Collins died, but even before Collins died, the provincial government was moving towards getting out of the North, as not getting involved, and yeah, whilst that might have pleased some people in the South, it certainly did leave a lot of Northern nationalists without a voice. And even if we look at, I'm not blaming Lloyd necessarily for this, but what happened with the Boundary Commission report and the tripartite agreement between the three governments afterwards, the fact that Lord Salisbury actually suggested there should be an ombudsman for Catholics in the North, someone like Joe Devlin, and Craig was having none of this, and in the South, let's have the South not pay some of the debt it owes to Britain, and the South readily accepted it as opposed to sticking up for national and Catholic rights in the North, and it did give itself as being the voice of Catholics in the North under Collins, but once he died, that went, and there was no longer of any interest in safeguarding the minority interest, and even securing proper human rights, proper electoral rights for Catholics in the North. He's pressurising both governments, British and Northern government. There was none of that anymore. So I think Blythe got some things right, but I think he also missed what was happening to Catholics in the North as well.
Okay, I have a strange sort of question for you now. People who work in museums are coming up to the centenary of Northern Ireland, putting exhibitions together and displays.
Yeah, and your online one on the Swansea riots was fantastic. It really was excellent.
Thanks very much. So when you get thinking about some of the material culture of the formation of Northern Ireland, it's not obvious what that might be. Like we have like a programme relating to the opening of the Northern Parliament in the collection. But there's not a great deal of other things. Have you come across in your work any material culture that stands out that is indicative of that period? Anything that strikes you? It might be a completely unfair question, but I thought I'd pose it.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I think when it comes to like what represents partition, I suppose, what would be good, kind of either reports or documents or even clothing or whatever. I think the best thing I would think would be the customs posts and around the actual when the customs barrier came in. I know it was after partition, it was 1923, but that to me is kind of the the physical manifestation of border and partition is best summed up by the creation of customs barriers. So there definitely are cards, available, notices available. There are, I know in Kew in London, there are really good kind of lists of what goods are can go into in and out of each territory, what roads can be passed, can't be passed. Loads of paraphernalia around that. I'm sure you could get some material from even huts. There's lots of temporary huts made. So if I was going to do an exhibition on how best to manifest partition, I think something around the customs posts would best sum it up. And it obviously would resonate with people today with the threat of a hard border coming into Ireland as was the case for the last 4 years.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Actually, I never thought about a custom post.
But also, I've said a lot of in my book, as I show, in a lot of cases there was no partition. So it was as you were in terms of organisations. Didn't prevent them from doing what they did before. In many instances, they continued on as they still do as all Ireland bodies. So you can't represent partition through that because there was no partition in those bodies.
That's very interesting. Though. Thanks, Dad. You love that right back at me. So our final question, and we put that to a number of speakers now. So we're coming up to the centenary year. We're in the centenary year of Northern Ireland anniversary. So are you optimistic about plans to mark or celebrate the centenary? Is there anything that gives you hope? Is there anything that gives you grounds for pessimism?
Well, I think people who were involved in commemorating partition should treat people like adults and not treat people like idiots for a start. So this, I'm not very optimistic based on what I saw from the Northern Ireland office in terms of its shared island and our story. It's not a shared history. It's not our story because it's a deeply divided society. And partition, there's very different viewpoints of what partition was, whether you're from a unionist perspective or from a nationalist perspective. And I think people have to realise that is the case. Don't be afraid of it. We're not talking about something that's a joyful occasion here because partition was not seen as a joyful occasion by nationalists. It was and unionists have every reason to celebrate it because it allowed unionists to remain in Britain and part of the United Kingdom. But for nationalists, partition was an unmitigated disaster, particularly for Catholics in the north. So I think we have to accept what happened, and it was a very messy partition. It was very divisive. There was a lot of things that were gone incredibly wrong. That has to be recognised. You treat people like people in Northern Ireland know they live in a divided society. They don't need to be told about we're living in a shared history where it's our story together. It's not true. And I think if people are and also we have to remember when we're commemorating events, we're not commemorating what happened 100 years ago. We're talking about today. Commemorations are always about today and how today's how 100 years events 100 years ago affect today. So let's be honest. What are people trying to do with commemorations here? I personally just think tell the story, warts and all. And we're going to in the south. It's going to be very difficult as well with the treaty division and the civil war next year. They have to be dealt with. You have to deal them head on. You can't just scapegoat around them and pretend that it's all shared history. It isn't. It's divided history. So it has to be told as such.
Yeah, okay. No, that's interesting. I suppose to a certain extent I share that view in that sensitive histories are insensitive. So you tell people what happened as best as you can, warts and all. I think that's the best you can do. You know what I mean?
It is going to lead to division, but that is what that history is. It's a divisive history. So we just have to accept that, and instead of scapegoating around it and pretend it's we're all one happy family. That's just not the case. And if people look at it honestly and are brave in how they analyse what the partition story was and what the real partition story was, try and get it down into as much detail as possible. Like what was good about the 1916 Rising commemorations was that it delved into new areas that hadn't been studied before, like how children were affected, or how women were affected. So yeah, more of that, like how are women affected, how are children affected by partition? Bring out more stories. And I did try to do that in my book and say, this just isn't about politics and security. There are a lot of other aspects to partition, like religion, education, the law, business, trade, all of these things. Let's explore how everything was affected by partition, as opposed to just focus on the political and security elements, which have been analysed quite a bit to date.
Yeah, no, I think that's the great thing about your book is it goes into all these different aspects that, you know, you might never have thought about, and once you see your chapter head, it's like, oh, that makes sense, you know. So really interesting. Cormac, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you, Karen, for inviting me.
And thank you for joining us at home.